Hey everyone, welcome back to another dive into the past. The world once paid a king's ransom for frozen water, believing this cold gift was reserved only for the gods. The year was 1806. The place was Boston, Massachusetts. But the global perspective of the early 19th century was radically different from today's. Cold was not a feature of life. Cold was a season. Cold was an immovable, unmanufacturable fact of northern geography. Outside the winter months, or south of the Mason-Dixon line, true chilling was simply absent. It was the great global void. This absence defined society. Food spoiled fast, medicines failed. Luxury was measured in degrees of decay. People could conquer continents. They could invent steam engines. They could write soaring poetry about liberty and reason, but they could not reliably preserve a stick of butter in August. This historical reality framed ice as an unthinkable commodity. It was a contradiction in terms. Water, by its very nature, belonged to the fluid world. Freezing it required an act of nature, a vast, indiscriminate, and uncontrollable process. Taking that frozen water and moving it thousands of miles across the equator seemed less like business and more like outright lunacy. The wealthy tried everything. Small fortunes were already spent on the illusion of cold. They experimented with chemical reactions. Saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, was mixed with water. This process drew heat from the surrounding air. The solution provided a temporary, lukewarm chilling effect. It was cumbersome. It was expensive. It failed to produce true, bone-deep cold. A cool drink was possible. Ice cream remained a myth. These methods were academic parlor tricks. They were footnotes in the long history of discomfort. The materials used were rare. The results were ephemeral. The masses never even saw this kind of cooling. For them, cold was literally invisible after the spring thaw. It was a ghost. The entire system was ready for a disruption. It did not need a better chemical. It needed an industrial-scale idiot. But wait a moment. The world always underestimates the power of a ridiculous idea. Enter Frederic Tudor. He was not a scientist. He was not an engineer. He was a young, wealthy Bostonian. The man possessed exactly one quality of historical significance: boundless, almost delusional confidence. He was bored by the cotton trade. He despised the shipping of rum and spices. Tudor had grander visions. He saw the world. He saw the heat. He saw the vast, pristine sheets of frozen ponds near his family estate. The idea was simple: cut the ice, ship the ice, sell the ice. The simplicity was the source of the ridicule. Critics laughed in his face. They called him the Ice King, a derisive joke at first. They pointed out the obvious flaws. Ice melts. A ship full of ice sailing to the Caribbean would become a ship full of water. The venture seemed designed to turn solid assets into liquid losses. Tudor pressed ahead. His own family dismissed the plan as Tudor's folly. In 1806, he chartered a brig. He loaded 70 tons of glistening, fresh-cut ice. The destination? Martinique. The journey was not an engineering challenge. It was a philosophical experiment. Could the unthinkable be commanded? The packing methods were hilariously crude. No one understood insulation. The crew simply threw the blocks into the cargo hold. They tried using hay and sawdust. The idea was to fill the gaps. It helped slow the melt, but only just. The physics of heat transfer were a foreign language. The ship arrived in Martinique. The local population was baffled. Ice was something seen only in the pages of books. The few remaining blocks were treated like literal treasures from the Arctic Circle. The cargo was largely gone. 75 tons of the shipment had returned to the sea. The remaining 5 tons sold slowly. Tudor's initial profit was a staggering loss. The Ice King's reign began with bankruptcy. This was the first lesson in the commodity business. The problem was not the cutting. The problem was the container. Tudor went back to the drawing board. He faced debtor's prison. He was ridiculed further, but the man was persistent. He began a meticulous, decade-long study of heat and insulation. He worked with carpenters. He worked with shipbuilders. He developed an obsession with shavings, air gaps, and non-conductive materials. The breakthrough was a change in philosophy. Ice was not the commodity. The absence of heat was the commodity. He learned to use double hulls. He lined the storage areas with thick, compacted layers of wood chips. He sealed the chambers completely. The goal was to create a vacuum of temperature. The ice blocks themselves were cut into perfect, immense cubes. They were packed tightly. The density prevented air pockets. Air pockets carry heat. The new methods worked. The losses dropped dramatically. A shipment to Calcutta, on the other side of the world, was a true test. The journey lasted 4 months. The ship sailed directly across the equator. A significant portion of the ice survived. It arrived in India solid and ready for sale. Calcutta reacted with astonishment. The sight of a man-made iceberg was simply astonishing. Ice was the ultimate status symbol. It appeared in the Governor General's palace. It chilled the drinks of the East India Company elite. It was luxury distilled. The initial price was an equivalent of a modern high-end appliance. This was the true moment of global chill. Tudor's system was a marvel of logistical efficiency. He designed specialized tools. He invented an ice plow. Horses cut deep grooves in the frozen lakes. He used long saws to detach the blocks. He developed a huge, organized labor force. They worked with almost an industrial military precision. Winter was no longer a downtime for labor. It was a harvest. The irony was profound. This cheap, abundant frozen water was now the key to global commerce. It unlocked new possibilities for food. Suddenly, fish caught in Boston could be delivered to New York. Fruit from the tropics could travel north. The ice trade was not just about cold drinks. It was about creating a functional, interconnected global food system. It even transformed medicine. Hospitals in the South could now treat fever patients reliably. Doctors could perform complex surgeries. Before ice, a patient in the tropics had little recourse against intense, lingering heat. The white blocks became an essential medical tool. The luxury item had morphed into a necessity. Tudor, the Ice King, was no longer a joke. He died a wealthy man, having successfully monetized nothing more than the lack of a thermometer. His story is a masterclass in stubbornness. He took the most common element in his backyard, wrapped it in sawdust, and convinced the world it was gold. The age of thermal isolation was over. The world became smaller, cooler, and more interconnected. This quiet, frigid industry laid the foundation for every cold storage unit, every refrigerated truck, and every air-conditioned room that exists today. The global chill began with a block of ice, a simple ship, and a man who refused to believe in the impossible.
The 19th century viewed winter as a tax. It was a tedious season. It shut down shipping. It made travel dangerous. Worst of all, it produced millions of tons of entirely useless frozen water. This ice was considered trash. It was a disposable inconvenience. It was something to be cleared, complained about, and awaited the thaw. No one considered it a resource. The idea was absurd. It was anti-commerce. Then, a young gentleman from a wealthy Boston family decided he would sell the trash. His name was Frederic Tudor. His family was old money. They were respectable people. Tudor, however, was cursed with an excess of imagination. He saw the ice on Fresh Pond not as a barrier, but as a vast, untapped gold mine. It was a crystalline treasure waiting to be mined. This was 1805. The concept sounded immediately insane to everyone who heard it. Tudor wanted to take frozen New England water. He planned to ship it to the hottest corners of the planet. His early logistics were an embarrassment. The planning reflected his amateur status. The scheme began near Fresh Pond, Massachusetts. This body of water, peaceful in the summer, became his industrial battleground in the winter. The absurdity started here. The gentleman needed to turn a fragile natural phenomenon into a durable, transportable good. The first tools were laughably primitive. He employed farmers. He hired local laborers. They used axes and long, unwieldy saws. The saws were dragged across the slick, treacherous surface. The men scored the ice by hand. They were trying to cut perfect, square blocks from a material that constantly threatened to drown them. This was not factory production. It was glacial butchery. The labor was brutal. The efficiency was non-existent. The blocks were pulled from the water using crude tongs and ropes. They were enormous. They were incredibly heavy. They had to be slid up wooden ramps to the shore. It was backbreaking work performed in sub-zero temperatures. It was all for a product that literally vanished under pressure. The sight must have been pure comedy. The refined gentleman was directing a ragtag crew. They were sweating in the freezing air. They were trying to subdue nature's own refrigeration, all while being watched by neighbors convinced the entire operation was performance art. This immense effort was simply the prelude to the true folly. The ice needed storage. It was moved to rudimentary ice houses. These were simply large, windowless barns built near the pond. The construction materials were timber and thin planking. There was no science to the architecture. There was only a vague hope that walls would deter heat. The harvested ice was packed inside. Tudor directed his men to use hay and sawdust as insulation. This was the conventional wisdom of the time. The materials were cheap, they were bulky, they seemed to offer some separation from the outer world. But insulation is about density. It is about eliminating air pockets. Hay and sawdust do the opposite. They are perfect conductors of heat. They simply failed to understand heat transfer. They did not grasp the science of specific gravity. They only knew the ice was cold. The walls of the ice house offered only the illusion of preservation. The waste was catastrophic. Tudor was harvesting tons of ice. He was storing gallons of water. The floor of the house was constantly draining. The initial investment was dissolving right alongside the product. Every sunrise seemed to bring a new layer of loss. The entire enterprise was a ticking clock. The logistics of moving the ice compounded the issues. The blocks had to be carted over snowy roads. They were taken to the Boston harbor. The journey itself was a constant drain. The rough carts allowed the blocks to shift. Shifting created friction. Friction created heat. The ice was literally burning itself up on the way to the docks. But wait a moment. The first shipment was even more absurd. In 1806, Tudor sent 80 tons of fresh pond ice to Martinique. The ship was the favorite. It was an ordinary brig. The cargo hold was not prepared for this volatile material. The sailors were confused. The captain was likely miserable. They were accustomed to hauling rum, sugar, and tobacco. They were now hauling solid water. The conditions of the voyage were a cruel joke played by physics. The ship sailed into the tropics. The hull was heated by the sun. The air was thick and humid. The heat was transferred directly to the cargo. The 80 tons began to weep. The ship developed a constant, terrifying bilge problem. The ice was turning the ship into a mobile water park. The surviving accounts paint a picture of total disaster. By the time the favorite reached the Caribbean, almost all of the ice was gone. The remaining 5 or 6 tons were sodden, irregular lumps. Tudor had managed to ship water to a place already surrounded by it. The local reaction was complete mockery. The inhabitants of Martinique had never seen ice. They certainly did not want to pay for this half-melted, mysterious solid. They viewed the entire delivery as an elaborate Bostonian prank. Tudor returned home not just penniless, but $4,000 in debt. This was a king's ransom at the time. He was a laughingstock. The newspapers were merciless. He was the Ice King whose entire kingdom had dissolved into the ocean. The folly was complete. His initial venture was a massive public failure. It served only as a cautionary tale for his peers. But the obsession remained. The humiliation only fueled the fire. He lost the money, he nearly lost his freedom, yet he kept studying the ice, the hay, and the wood. He realized the battle was not about keeping the cold in, the battle was about keeping the heat out. The gentleman's folly at Fresh Pond had ended in ruin, but this monumental failure provided the only possible foundation for the global refrigeration revolution. The lesson was learned through loss. The world was about to get very, very cold.
The docks of Boston Harbor smelled of salt, fish, and cynicism. The year was 1806. The air was thick with financial doubt. A gentleman named Frederic Tudor was risking everything. His family had warned him. His creditors laughed openly. The city treated his business venture like a morbid theatrical spectacle. It was a comedy of errors waiting for its final, expensive curtain call. He stood beside a small brigantine. The vessel was named Favorite. It was about to embark on a journey that defied all logic. The cargo was frozen water. The destination was Martinique. The Caribbean was a place where heat reigned supreme. This was a trade mission designed for failure. Tudor watched his cargo disappear into the hull. It was 80 tons of solid, gleaming ice. The blocks were rough-hewn. They had been hacked from Fresh Pond, Massachusetts. They were loaded with haste and desperation. The packing methods were a masterclass in ignorance. The blocks were separated by hay. They were cushioned by wood shavings. The idea was simple protection. The reality was catastrophic insulation. The air pockets were traps. They were conduits for the heat of the open ocean. Tudor had borrowed heavily. His entire inheritance was staked on this single shipment. The moment the Favorite pulled away from the dock, the financial clock began to tick down to zero. The skepticism was universal. People knew the rules of the natural world. Ice melted. The only mystery was the exact day the ship would become a vessel of pure water. The Favorite sailed south. The ship immediately hit warmer currents. The New England chill quickly vanished. The temperature outside the hull began its steady climb. Inside the hold, the true battle commenced. It was a silent, invisible war fought between the elements. The crew was immediately unnerved. They were seasoned sailors. They were used to the ocean's violence. They understood storms and reefs. But this cargo was insidious. It was attacking the ship from within. The ice was a quiet, constantly diminishing guest. The first few days were manageable. The coldness radiating from the cargo was noticeable. It created a strange, localized chill below the deck. But the sun beat down. The hull absorbed the heat. The wooden boards became thermal sponges. The ice started to weep. It began slowly. Then it became a steady, rhythmic leak. The captain's log entries became preoccupied with the bilge. The constant accumulation of water was terrifying. It suggested a leak in the hull, but the source was internal. The precious commodity was turning itself into a deadly liability. The sailors had to take turns bailing the hold. The water had to be pumped back into the Atlantic. This was a monumental effort. They were literally throwing the cargo overboard, scoop by scoop. The absurdity was not lost on them. They were laboring ceaselessly to return the product to its natural state. The ship crossed the invisible line where the tropics began. The air changed completely. It became wet and heavy. The humidity alone seemed to chew through the remaining ice.
Every gasp of hot air pulled more latent heat into the hold. The temperature differential was immense. The laws of thermodynamics were winning decisively. The rhythmic chipping and cracking sounds came from below deck. The vast blocks were settling. They were shedding their mass. The sound was the sound of money evaporating. It was the sound of Tudor's fortune turning to vapor. The captain had a difficult choice. Should he race the ship, risking storm damage, or should he take a more circuitous route, but calmer? Every decision had a thermal cost. Days turned into weeks. The tropical heat seemed endless. The sun was an unrelenting, powerful thief. The favorite became a paradox. The ship was surrounded by water, yet the crew was desperately trying to rid themselves of the water inside. The men grew weary of the constant bailing. They began to resent the frozen blocks. The cargo of hope was now the cargo of misery. But wait a moment. They were still moving forward. The financial pressure was immense. Tudor had written promissory notes based on the successful sale of the ice. If the cargo failed, he was ruined. His reputation would be destroyed. He would face jail time. This voyage was not just a shipping venture. It was a race against destitution. The favorite sailed past the northern islands of the Caribbean chain. The crew knew the end was near. The sight of land provided no comfort. The islands meant stifling humidity and intense, landlocked heat. The last vestiges of the ice would face their greatest challenge yet. The ship approached the French colony of Martinique. The sails were down, the anchor was dropped. The destination was reached. The custom officials rowed out. The local merchants arrived, curious about the mad Bostonian's promise. They wanted to see the impossible. A massive crowd gathered at the dockside. The people waited for the unveiling. They waited for the impossible revelation. The captain ordered the hatch opened. A wave of surprisingly cool air rushed out. The scent of damp wood and cold water filled the air. There, at the bottom of the hull, was the proof. The remaining cargo was still visible. They were not solid, immaculate blocks anymore. They were strange, irregular masses. They were covered in a film of water. The final tally was impossible to immediately confirm. The blocks were sodden, slippery, and unstable. What was left was only a fraction of what had begun the voyage. But something remained. The water had not completely won. Tudor's first attempt had reached its destination, but the question remained, was it enough to save the king, or merely enough to prove the crown was already sinking?
The failure in Martinique was absolute. It was public. It was financially ruinous. Frederic Tudor was left with massive debts. His reputation was shattered. The entire venture was declared a lunatic's folly. But the man was not broken. He was merely informed. The catastrophe had provided data. He learned precisely how quickly 80 tons of ice could vanish into the warm Atlantic. The problem, he concluded, was not the cold. The problem was the container. Tudor pivoted completely. He ceased to be a simple merchant. He became an obsessive, self-taught physicist of cold. He treated the preservation of ice as a military operation. It was a siege against the universal laws of thermodynamics. The enemy was heat. The defense had to be perfect. He knew that the initial packing was fatally flawed. Throwing a little hay around the ice blocks was useless. Hay allowed air to circulate freely. Circulating air is the primary mechanism of heat transfer. It quickly carries warmth to the frozen core. He needed to eliminate air. He needed to build silence. Tudor began experimenting with materials. He studied wood. He examined paper. He obsessed over every substance that might slow the inevitable thermal creep. This was his laboratory phase.
It involved tiny samples, meticulous notes, and constant frustration. The world was demanding fire. He was studying cold. The key finding was both simple and profound. The insulation itself was secondary. The primary defense was the void. He realized air pockets were the enemy. Air pockets allow movement. Movement means convection. Convection is the rapid transfer of heat. To stop the melting, the air must be trapped. The movement must be frozen in place. This realization led to the icehouse revolution. Tudor designed a new type of icehouse. It looked unassuming from the outside. It was a simple timber structure. Inside, it was a fortress of thermal defense. He mandated a double-walled construction. The outer wall met the elements. The inner wall protected the cargo. The space between these two walls was the critical zone. It was not left empty. It was not filled with hay. This cavity was packed absolutely solid. The material used was sawdust. Sawdust was a trash product. It was abundant near any timber mill. It was useless. That was exactly its genius. When compressed, sawdust traps air in millions of tiny, independent chambers. It creates a vast cellular structure. These small pockets cannot move. They cannot transfer heat through convection. The double walls and the dense packing created a massive thermal resistance layer. The outer heat had to chew through many feet of material. It had to defeat 1,000,000 tiny stationary air bubbles. This slowed the heat transfer down to a crawl. This was the anatomy of successful preservation. The design was quickly adapted for sea travel. A ship's cargo hold was entirely rebuilt. It was lined with heavy timber. The ship effectively carried a box inside a box. The gap between the two structures was packed tight with the same compressed sawdust. The entire compartment was sealed almost airtight. It became a thermal sarcophagus. The material had to be the correct kind of sawdust. Fine shavings from soft woods like pine worked best. They had lower density. They trapped more air. This level of technical specification separated Tudor's method from the amateur attempts. The Ice King was now a logistics scientist. But wait a moment. The packaging extended beyond the ship's walls. The ice itself had to be perfect. Tudor invested in better tools for the harvest. He developed the famous ice plow. It was drawn by horses. It scored the frozen lake surface with immense symmetrical precision. The men followed with long saws. The goal was to cut blocks of exact, massive dimensions. The blocks were cut into perfect cubes. They were enormous. They weighed hundreds of pounds each. These cubes were then packed into the hold without any gaps. They were stacked brick against brick. The ice blocks served as their own primary insulation. A massive block of ice has a low surface area to volume ratio. This is simple geometry. Less surface area is exposed to heat. The exterior melted slowly. This melting formed a thin layer of cold water around the block. This water helped to insulate the massive core. The ice protected itself. The initial hay and sawdust packing was used to fill only the tiny gaps near the ceiling and the doors. The bulk of the cargo was solid, tightly packed frozen water. It was a single, immense, temporary iceberg created by human hands. The success was immediate and undeniable. Tudor's second shipment was a triumph of engineering. The losses were drastically reduced. A small percentage of the cargo was lost, not 95%. This meant profit. This meant the unthinkable was now commercially viable. The technological improvements were ridiculously simple. They involved trash material and basic physics. No steam engines were required, no advanced metallurgy was necessary. Just a deep understanding of heat and patience. Tudor revolutionized global trade using nothing more than wood and the byproduct of the sawmill. The anatomy of insulation had been cracked. The world's refrigeration future was secured, not by complex machinery, but by a precise application of common sawdust. The Ice King's fortune was forged in the tiny, trapped air pockets of Boston wood waste. The age of endless summer heat was finally drawing to a close.
The problem of the melting cargo was solved. The technology of the ice house was perfected. Frederic Tudor had conquered the physics of thermal transfer. But physics was only half the war. The other half was logistics. It was culture. It was human nature. The new challenge was geographical. It was the massive undertaking of establishing a permanent cold presence in the hottest places on Earth. A ship full of ice arriving successfully meant nothing if the cargo could not be unloaded fast. It needed immediate safe storage. It needed a retail system. It needed to create a market where one had never existed. Tudor's first target after the initial failure was Havana, Cuba. Havana was pure heat. It was a city of perpetual summer. The humidity was oppressive. Any block of ice brought ashore began its terminal decay instantly. The first step was building a permanent, indestructible thermal bunker. He sent carpenters ahead. He dispatched skilled workers with detailed plans. The Havana Ice House was constructed using the double-walled method. It was a fortress of sawdust and timber. The location was critical. It was near the docks for quick unloading. It was elevated slightly to prevent ground moisture. The ice arrived. It was unloaded swiftly. It was packed tight into the dark, cool chambers. This was the true genesis of the global cold chain. The successful shipment was merely the delivery vehicle. The permanent ice house was the headquarters. The people of Havana were initially hesitant. They had heard the stories. Ice was a strange northern novelty. It was expensive. It seemed utterly unnecessary. Tudor devised a brilliant, destructive marketing strategy. He gave the product away. He offered free ice to tavern owners. He paid them to put chilled drinks on their menus. He funded free samples of frozen desserts. He was not selling ice. He was selling a habit. He was selling a sensation. He was introducing the idea of temperature as pleasure. The gambit paid off immediately. Once a person felt the shock of cold on a 100-degree day, they could not go back. The novelty became an expectation. The luxury quickly transformed into a daily necessity. The market was not only created, it was addicted. But wait a moment. Tudor's ambition stretched far beyond the Caribbean. The ultimate test was Calcutta, India. This was a voyage of staggering distance. The route involved sailing down the Atlantic. It meant crossing the equator not once but twice. It required navigating around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope. The journey took nearly 4 months. This was the commercial equivalent of launching a spacecraft. The challenge was not only oceanic, it was political. Calcutta was the heart of the British East India Company's rule. To operate there required massive capital, political maneuvering, and a guaranteed supply chain. Tudor faced the entrenched bureaucracy of the world's most powerful corporation. He secured the necessary contracts. He chartered the immense ship Tuscany. The ship was refitted with the latest sawdust insulation. In 1833, the Tuscany left Boston with 180 tons of fresh pond ice. The journey was excruciating. It was a 4-month duel with the sun. When the ship finally sailed up the Hooghly River, it was a moment of pure spectacle. It was a ghost ship of winter arriving in the heart of the Bengali summer. The sight of the vessel was a curiosity. The sheer survival of the cargo was a miracle. The Ice King had to build his magnum opus here. The Calcutta Ice House was vast. It was built near the riverside. It followed the proven double-walled design, but the structure had to withstand the monsoon season. It had to deflect the constant searing humidity of the Bay of Bengal. It was constructed with a local understanding of material science. The architecture was deceptive. It was a simple, imposing warehouse, but inside, it was a finely tuned machine. The floors were heavily drained. The ceilings were insulated against solar radiation. It was a permanent, massive block of preserved New England winter installed in colonial India. The ice was expensive upon arrival. It was immediately purchased by the elite. The European residents suffering under the relentless Indian sun treated it like medical salvation. They used it to chill wine. They used it to make punch. They used it to cool their sickly children. The ice became the ultimate social marker. A man who could offer chilled drinks in Calcutta commanded respect. It became central to the rituals of colonial luxury. It was not just a product, it was a statement of power over the environment. The market adapted instantly. Local vendors purchased small quantities. They learned how to use insulated baskets to carry small portions across the city. The supply chain stretched from Boston's frozen ponds to the bustling streets of India. Tudor had not just shipped a product. He had successfully exported an entire climate. He had transplanted a piece of winter to a place that had never known it. The financial return from Calcutta was enormous. The distance was immense. The profits were exponential. The tropical gambit was successful. The Ice King had mastered the markets of two entirely different, scorching cultures. He proved that cold was not a feature of geography. It was merely a triumph of logistics and human will. The world was now permanently connected by a silent, invisible, frozen thread.
The Ice King had conquered Havana. He had defeated the bureaucracy of Calcutta. He had proven that New England winter could be shipped anywhere. The next challenge was not geographical distance. It was cultural proximity. It was the vast, warm, suspicious market of the American South. The problem was fundamentally psychological. Ice was available, but people did not yet want it. In the 19th century, cold water was considered dangerous. Doctors warned against it. They believed it shocked the system. They claimed it arrested digestion. A glass of chilled water in July was seen as an invitation to illness. It was a risk, not a pleasure. Tudor was not just selling frozen water. He was selling a radical shift in wellness philosophy. He had to convince a skeptical population that temperature was negotiable. He had to make cold desirable. The market creation strategy was calculated. It was brilliant. It was expensive. He focused on the places where people gathered. He targeted taverns and restaurants in southern cities like New Orleans and Charleston. He supplied them with ice free of charge. This was the opening salvo. The key was the delivery mechanism. He did not ask them to use it for preservation. He directed them to use it for pleasure. He created the concept of the iced beverage. The cold cocktail was his weapon. Sugar, alcohol, and ice formed an irresistible trinity. The initial resistance melted faster than the cubes in the glass. The sensation of a truly chilled drink on a sweltering afternoon was revolutionary. It bypassed reason. It attacked the senses directly. The free samples worked. The novelty quickly became addiction. The people demanded the chill. They sought the relief. The tavern owners were soon forced to become paying customers. Tudor had successfully woven his product into the social fabric of the South. But wait a moment. The supply chain was a nightmare. Tudor had to build an entire infrastructure across hostile territory. Ice houses were constructed in Savannah. Thermal bunkers were erected in Mobile. The entire operation was a long, thin logistical line running from Fresh Pond down the Atlantic coast. Each location presented its own terrifying challenge. The ice houses had to be built with local labor. They had to utilize the exact science of the double wall and sawdust fill. The structures were permanent declarations of war against the regional climate. The real nemesis was not the sun. The true enemy was unseen. It was relentless. It was humidity. Humidity is the ice cutter's greatest foe. It is water vapor floating in the air. The moment the ice house door opened, that vapor rushed in. It condensed instantly on the freezing surface of the ice blocks. The condensation itself released heat. The moisture then formed a thin film of water. That film actively transferred the external heat to the core of the ice. The process of melting accelerated exponentially in the thick, maritime air of the Gulf Coast. The ice houses were constantly fighting the very atmosphere. They were thermal islands under continuous siege. The management of the southern depots required intense vigilance. It demanded constant draining of the runoff water. It required meticulous door sealing. The entire operation was a suspense story, played out over the summer months. The local populace began to accept the inevitable. Ice was no longer suspicious. It was essential. The elite used it not just for drinks, but for sophisticated culinary needs. Ice cream became a sensation. The preservation of meat and dairy began to change the southern diet. They gained access to fresher food. They experienced fewer diseases related to spoilage. The American factor was a victory of marketing over medicine. Tudor changed what people drank. He changed what they ate. He fundamentally altered their expectation of comfort. Before Tudor, suffering in the summer heat was simply life. After Tudor, it was an inconvenience that could be solved with a simple delivery. The demand he created was enormous. The market reached a critical mass. The Ice King's fortune was secure. He had forced the culture to crave the cold. The world had now become irrevocably divided. There was the life before the chill. There was the comfortable, refrigerated life that followed. The quiet battle against humidity continued daily in every single ice house. And the silence of the ice house, full of trapped air and sawdust, confirmed the American factor was finally complete.
The Ice King had created global demand. The chilled cocktails of Havana, the iced champagne of Calcutta. The entire enterprise relied on one simple, crucial element: efficient supply. The early days of chaotic harvesting were over. Axes and crude handsaws were acceptable for a few tons of local ice. They were utterly useless for shipping thousands of tons worldwide. The sheer scale of the operation demanded industrialization. It demanded specialization. The chaos had to be replaced by geometry. Tudor's team realized that the shape of the ice block was just as important as the insulation around it. Irregular blocks wasted valuable space in the ship's hold. Gaps created air pockets. Air pockets generated heat transfer. The geometry of the block had to be perfect. The dimensions had to be uniform. The ice had to be cut with the precision of a jeweler. It had to be handled with the efficiency of a mine. The first major breakthrough was not steam power. It was not chemistry. It was a plow. It was called the ice plow. This tool was a magnificent invention of pure necessity. It was essentially a massive sled fitted with a row of sharp, heavy iron teeth. The teeth were designed to cut deep, parallel grooves into the thick surface of the frozen pond. The sheer mass of the plow was a statement of force. It weighed hundreds of pounds. This weight was necessary to score the ice deeply. A single horse provided the power. The horse was fitted with special spiked shoes.
These shoes provided traction on the slick, treacherous ice surface. The horse walked slowly. It pulled the heavy plow. The plow carved the first, crucial line. The work was methodical. The process was repeated. The plow cut a grid across the entire frozen surface of the pond. The horse walked back and forth. The plow's guiding mechanism ensured the lines were perfectly parallel. The distance between the lines was precise. This geometry was the foundation of the operation. The ice surface was no longer a natural wonder. It was a blueprint. It was a massive outdoor graph paper scored for cutting. But wait a moment. The plow only scored the surface. It did not make the final cut. The next tools were long two-man saws. These were not the common tools found in a carpenter's shop. They were specialized instruments. The blades were long and heavy. They were specifically designed to cut through the 1 to 2 foot thickness of the frozen water. The workers followed the plow grooves. They sawed down into the ice. They cut through the massive frozen field. The grid allowed them to separate the area into massive rectangular fields of ice. The work was laborious. It was rhythmic. It required immense coordination between the two men. These large fields were then separated into strips. These strips were the commercial unit of production. The ice looked like a giant frozen highway floating on the water. Finally, the strips were separated into the individual, perfect cubes. These were the commercial blocks destined for the tropics. The weight of each block was staggering. It required immense effort to separate them. The final block was often 22 inches square. This specific dimension became an industry standard. This perfection ensured zero wasted space inside the tightly packed cargo holds and ice houses. The geometry was the profit margin. The next logistical challenge was moving the thousands of individual blocks. The workers cut a large canal through the ice field. This canal led directly to the shore, where the ice house stood. The blocks were moved by floating them. The workers used long poles with hooks. They maneuvered the massive, heavy cubes through the narrow, water-filled channel. This method was simple. It was brilliant. Water did the work of the horse. The fluidity of the channel moved the blocks efficiently toward their destiny. At the shore, ramps were used. The blocks were hoisted out of the water. Later, simple mechanized conveyor systems were introduced. They were often powered by the same horse that had plowed the field. The horse was now working vertically. The block was lifted and carried up into the dark, sawdust-lined interior of the ice house. It was stacked by men who understood thermal loss better than most engineers. Every space was filled. Every gap was eliminated. The work was repetitive. It was cold. It was essential. The entire process was an early model of American industrial efficiency. Tudor had taken the chaotic gift of winter. He had applied simple, specialized tools and rigorous geometry. He turned the natural randomness of a frozen pond into a predictable, profitable supply chain. The quiet revolution was powered by the geometry of the block, the simple strength of the horse, and the unforgiving sharpness of the plow. The tools of the trade had finally conquered the heat.
The initial mockery was forgotten. The crippling debt was retired. The chaotic logistics had been perfected into a geometric ballet of saws and horses. The Ice King was no longer a joke. Frederic Tudor became a titan of industry. His empire was built on water and air. It was a crystal monopoly stretching across the equator. The fortune was immense. It was literally frozen. This was a business defined by volume. It was dependent on scale. Tudor's Massachusetts operations expanded far beyond Fresh Pond. Vast tracts of land were acquired around neighboring lakes. The annual harvest became a massive industrial event. By the 1840s, the volume was staggering. The annual ice harvest from the Boston region alone was measured in the hundreds of thousands of tons. This was not a side hustle. This was an economic engine. The sheer quantity defied belief. Tudor's control was total. He owned the specialized harvesting tools. He held the patents for the ice plow. He perfected the architectural plans for the insulating ice houses. He controlled the vital trade routes. He commanded a vast fleet of ships specially refitted for thermal protection. He created a vertically integrated monopoly. He controlled the entire process. He ran the operation from the cutting of the ice to the final delivery of the chilled glass in Calcutta. No one else could compete with his efficiency. No rival could match his scale. The price of chill reflected this control. In the domestic market, ice prices dropped steadily as the volume increased. This was strategic. The lower price broadened the appeal. It cemented the necessity of iced beverages for the middle class. Tudor created millions of new, loyal, dependent customers. But wait a moment. The foreign markets were where the true fortune was made. The margin was astronomical. A cubic foot of ice harvested in Boston cost mere pennies. That same cubic foot sold in Havana fetched $1. In the faraway port of Calcutta, the price climbed even higher. The sheer difficulty of the delivery justified the premium. The demand never slackened. The profit flowed back to Boston. It funded the expansion. It financed the construction of larger ice houses in every major port city south of the Mason-Dixon line and across the globe. The scale of the investment was repaid manifold. The Calcutta Ice House was a massive, permanent asset. It cost a small fortune to construct. It was a guarantee of future wealth. It was a fortress against market competition. The revenue generated was staggering. By the mid-19th century, Tudor's ice empire was valued in the millions. This was a time when $1,000 was a comfortable annual income. He was wealthier than most captains of industry in the new American Republic. His frozen fortune made him a peer of the railroad barons. The trade had a subtle, powerful effect on other industries. The ships carrying ice did not return empty. The chilling effect allowed them to carry perishable goods back to New England. Fruit from Cuba, spices from India. The ice trade was a two-way street. It stimulated international commerce in ways that had never been possible. Tudor became an international figure. He was known simply as the Ice King. The title, once an insult, became a declaration of power. His name was synonymous with cold. He had achieved the impossible. He had monetized winter itself. The monopoly was secured by knowledge. Tudor guarded the secrets of insulation fiercely. The precise dimensions of the ice house, the correct density of the sawdust, the method of stacking, this knowledge was patented. It was proprietary. Competitors tried and failed. They wasted time and money duplicating the disastrous early attempts. They ended up with cargo holds full of water. Tudor had already learned the hard lessons. He paid in debt and humiliation. His competitors paid with failure. He maintained his technological edge for decades. The peak volume was astounding. In the later years of his operation, Tudor was moving close to 150,000 tons of ice annually. This immense weight was shifted purely to keep drinks cool and food fresh across half the globe. It was an industrial effort dedicated to comfort. The legacy was a physical transformation of the global economy. Tudor proved that controlling temperature was the ultimate source of modern wealth. He made preservation a business model. He turned a natural phenomenon into a human-controlled commodity. He sold frozen water. He achieved a literal crystal empire. The price of chill was enormous for those who purchased it. For the Ice King, it was the key to unlimited wealth. The Boston ponds kept freezing every winter. The money kept flowing every summer. The frozen fortune was safe within the double walls of the empire.
The Crystal Empire was built on profit. It was powered by cold cocktails and expensive ice cream. But the most important consequences of the ice trade were entirely unseen. They were unintentional. They were hidden in the statistical silence of public health. Before consistent cold storage, food poisoning was simply a part of life. Meat spoiled quickly. Dairy turned sour in hours. Disease outbreaks linked to spoiled food were rampant. Cholera and severe dysentery were constant threats. The summer months brought a wave of predictable, often fatal illnesses. The cheap, clean ice changed this reality. Tudor's vast network of ice houses and refrigerated storage meant markets could hold fresh provisions longer. They could preserve milk. They could keep meat from decaying rapidly. This stable access to non-spoiled food had a profound, if unquantified, effect on the health of cities. The ice itself was clean. It was cut from pristine, deep-frozen northern ponds. This was far safer than the brackish, often polluted well water common in crowded southern cities. When that clean ice chilled drinks, it reduced the transmission of local waterborne pathogens. The doctors of the era did not immediately understand germ theory. They could not trace the precise cause and effect, but the correlation was clear. Where ice became widely available, the summer sickness rates dropped. The cold became a quiet, powerful medicine. It was an invisible shield against unseen biological threats. This massive public health victory was achieved entirely by accident. But wait a moment. The cold also fueled a massive social revolution. Tudor's ice was the midwife to modern mass-produced beer. Before the ice trade, most American beer was ale. Ale ferments quickly at warm room temperatures. It did not require refrigeration. It was often heavy. It spoiled fast. Lager changed everything. Lager requires cold. It needs to ferment at low temperatures. This process is called lagering. It requires massive, consistent cold storage for extended periods. The breweries needed tons of ice. They needed it year-round. Tudor provided that cold. The vast Boston harvest made it possible to build enormous chilled cellars in Milwaukee and St. Louis. Brewers could now make lager cheaply. They could produce it year-round. They could ship it farther without spoilage. The American beer industry exploded. The consumption of light, cold lager became a national obsession. The same principle applied to the soft drink industry. Carbonated water became immensely popular. Cold enhances the sensation of fizz. It makes the drinks feel sharper. Tudor's cold infrastructure made soft drinks possible on a massive scale. He provided the temperature that defined entire sectors of the food and beverage industry. The Ice King inadvertently shaped the American palate for the next 2 centuries. He made everything cold, bubbly, and mass-marketable. The empire of frozen water seemed invincible. It was massive, it was profitable, it was a perfect system of natural harvest and engineered preservation. But the 19th century was defined by relentless technological change. The same scientific progress that Tudor harnessed was preparing to destroy his creation. The future of cold was not natural, it was mechanical. Scientists in Europe and America were working on the concept of artificial refrigeration. They were experimenting with compressed gases. They were exploring the power of latent heat and pressure. They were trying to manufacture cold, not just transport it. The idea was revolutionary. A machine could make ice anywhere. It could make it in the tropics. It could make it on demand. It did not require a ship. It did not require a frozen pond in Boston. It did not require a single piece of sawdust. The technology was clumsy at first. It was expensive. It broke down often, but it represented an existential threat. Tudor's business model relied entirely on the scarcity of natural cold. If cold could be manufactured, his monopoly meant nothing. The invention of the refrigerator was the death sentence for the Ice King's natural empire. The silent, unseen battle against foodborne illness had been won. The great social habits of beer and soda were established. Tudor had completed his mission. He had changed the world. But the final irony remained. The man who mastered the cold was about to be rendered obsolete by a small churning machine. The end of the Crystal Empire was not a meltdown in the tropical sun. It was the low, steady hum of a compressor starting up in a laboratory. The reign of the Ice King was ending. The age of electric chill was beginning.
The Ice King's empire stood at its zenith. The ponds were scored, the sawdust was packed, the ships sailed the globe, dispensing the luxury of winter. The sound of the ice plow slicing the frozen surface was the sound of massive, predictable profit. But a new sound was beginning to echo from laboratories. It was a low, insistent whirring. It was the sound of a machine attempting to cheat nature. It was the sound of the future. The natural ice trade relied on a fundamental weakness. The product was melting from the moment it was cut. It required a colossal effort of logistics and insulation simply to slow its decay. The energy expended was enormous. The invention of mechanical refrigeration targeted this single flaw. Early machines were clumsy, they were dangerous, they used volatile chemicals like ammonia and ether. They were expensive to run. They required complex maintenance. Initially, they were no threat to the reliable, cheap ice harvested from New England ponds. But the science was inevitable. The principle was sound. The machine generated cold in situ. It required no shipping. It needed no insulation against a 3-month voyage across the equator. It produced cold on demand. The first major market conquest for the machines was the brewery. Tudor had helped create the modern lager industry. Brewers were his biggest customers. But the huge insulated cellars needed constant resupply. The mechanical chillers solved that problem entirely. They provided massive, consistent, temperature-controlled cold that never needed bailing. The breweries were the first to abandon the Ice King. The same logic applied to cold storage warehouses. Commercial meat packers and large dairies needed absolute certainty. A mechanical chiller offered that certainty. The massive, beautiful architecture of the double-walled ice house suddenly became a liability. It was a costly monument to an outdated process. The end of the cold rush was slow. It was not a sudden collapse. It was a steady, agonizing decline over several decades. Frederic Tudor died in 1864. He passed away still the king of his realm. He was still the undisputed master of natural cold. He did not live to see the final technological defeat. He was spared the sight of his great empire dissolving, not into water, but into obsolescence. The industry tried to fight back. They tried to innovate. They invested in new, faster ice plows. They built electric-powered conveyor belts. But these were mere improvements on a failing premise. They were attempting to speed up the harvest of a product that science had already learned to manufacture. By the 1890s, the change was irreversible. The mechanical ice plants began to dot the landscape. They were built directly in the cities, right next to the customers. They produced pure,
clean ice blocks in the middle of summer. They did not depend on a New England winter. The massive, silent ships that once carried the frozen water to India were retired. The complex logistic chain that linked Fresh Pond to Calcutta vanished. The capital flowed away from the ponds and toward the engineers. The great ice houses of the South stood empty. The sawdust insulation remained, a dusty testament to a brilliant bygone era. The timber rotted. The ponds froze over every year, but the activity on them shrank to nothing. The vast, scored fields of ice simply melted, unnoticed, into the spring thaw. The enduring legacy of Frederic Tudor was not the ice itself, it was the culture he created. He taught the world to crave constant, easy cold. He paved the way for the machine age by creating the market the machines needed. The electric refrigerator became the standard not because it was invented, but because Tudor had made the world addicted to its product. He made cold a permanent expectation. He made the summer sickness retreat. He made the cold beverage a daily ritual. He proved that the control of temperature was foundational to modern life. The final irony is complete. The ice trade, which fought heat with nature, was replaced by a continuous, low-level chemical reaction. The electric chill that defines the modern world is a constant, subtle reminder of the man who first thought to sell a piece of winter. The whirring of the machine took over. The silent ponds were left to sleep, their brief, glorious commercial life over. The chill remains, woven into the fabric of the electric world.